Okay, so I'm going to take a look at the politics of boom and bust part two. I'll try to keep this one a little bit shorter, but let's be real, you know me, and I like to talk a lot about this. And some of it's pretty straightforward. It's a shorter piece, but I think some of it gets a little bit more complicated. So the first thing we're going to look at is the election. So we know that Calvin Coolidge took over for Harding. He ran again on his own, and then we're stepping into another election where 1928, Herbert Hoover is running. He's got a lot of experience, fame throughout the country. He was the Secretary of Commerce. He helped in World War I with all of those voluntary food movements to help the war effort. He's an interesting person. He has a great and varied background. He was an orphan and he worked his way through Stanford. So this really colors a lot of his policies moving forward. As you can see, he was a mining engineer, he was a businessman, but the very fact that he struggled throughout his childhood but was able to go to Stanford made him maybe lack some sympathy to people who found themselves in hard times. Similar to Carnegie, when we talked about Andrew Carnegie and the idea of wealth, and he truly couldn't understand. If he was able to work as this young immigrant who came over so young and work up to being one of the richest men in the United States, why couldn't other people just provide for themselves? So we see a little bit of that same philosophy in Hoover, which helps explain a bit his response to the Great Depression. He has no public office experience, which again, sometimes that's attractive to people. Looking at the outsider, not a career politician. The Democrats are still struggling a bit to come up with a national identity. With the brief rule of Woodrow Wilson, I mean, he did have 2 terms, it wasn't brief in that sense, but in interrupting a long Republican run, they haven't had much success in bringing the country together under one philosophy, the Democrats of one country. They do pick a governor of New York, Alfred Smith, L. Smith. He's described as a wet, which means he is for repealing prohibition. Many people in major cities, especially in the Northeast, identified with that wet philosophy, that prohibition was just ridiculous and it wasn't helpful. But some people looked at that as a downfall, and so he did take on a dry running mate to balance the ticket, but that's confusing. What kind of agenda would you have? Would it be wet? Would it be dry? Are you going to try to stay the course? We don't know. Other people describe him as too urban. So for people living in more rural areas of the country, which of course there were more of them in 1928 than we would experience, the issues that he might run on don't apply to them. He's also Catholic, and we've run into this before in the Democratic Party, that they do choose a Catholic. They are more diverse in the makeup of their party than the Republican Party, which tended to be Anglo-Saxon and Protestant. And this is an obstacle for L. Smith because people did not yet, I don't even know if they ever have really yet, come around to having a Catholic as a viable running mate. So this will be pretty easy for Herbert Hoover. Before we even see the stock market crash in 1929, we know that farmers already are experiencing a crisis, a financial crisis. And Calvin Coolidge was very resistant to trying to solve that. We saw that in the last video. He vetoed a couple of measures that Congress took to try to help with the surplus and stabilize prices, keeping them high. Usually if we have a surplus, the price falls and then farmers are in that cycle. And so Congress was able to do that. This is going to be part of a long stretch of initiatives, legislation that we're going to associate as part of a response to the Great Depression. You'll see them bolded not only through this video, but in videos subsequent that talk about the New Deal. If they're bolded, they're important. There's so much legislation that we're going to talk about over the next week. It's impossible to know it all. So the bolded ones are really important. What I'll probably do one of the days next week is look at charting this. Let's put it all in a chart, make sure we know the legislation, what it was supposed to do, what it did, was it successful. So the Agricultural Marketing Act in 1929 was the first attempt to help farmers. This farm board was created. It could buy up those surpluses so that we can keep prices relatively stable for the farmers. So even though we'll talk about this as response to the Great Depression, this is under Hoover. And I know that Hoover gets a bad rap because of his later inability to solve the crisis. I think sometimes that's unfair, but also it's part of the personality and what he projects. Hawley-Smoot tariff. This here is extremely important because it was just a bad decision. It was supposed to protect farmers. If you can see right here, coming out of the Senate with 1,000 changes to this tariff that started in the House is insanity. 1,000 changes. It's the highest protective tariff in the nation's peacetime history, 60%. That's not going to help farmers. And what happens, if you can see the year that it actually passes and is instituted, it's 1930. The stock market has crashed. This has made the depression that most countries were already starting to experience worse. And we've talked about this before. When the US puts up a tariff like this, other countries are going to respond with another tariff. We talked about reciprocity and things like that. So that if each country puts up a tariff, it basically eliminates foreign trade. And while we're looking in the short term of trying to insulate and protect ourselves, it's hurting. It's cutting people out all over the world from that ability to trade with each other. We're realizing that we are interconnected and we cannot insulate. So this is one of probably the worst decisions that was made as a measure to try to deal with the fallout of the crash, which it comes. It's known as Black Tuesday. You may have heard, if you're doing any reading of the news, Black Monday. So Black Monday is something we experienced in 1987. It was another sharp downturn in the stock market. The late 80s was another time period of recession, and you probably heard a lot about that in the news because with our recent downturn in the stock market as a response to a number of things, but mainly the virus, is they're measuring the fallout as compared to 87. So that was Black Monday. Black Tuesday is in 1929. A number of things, kind of like dominoes, fell into place, and it's basically all built on panic. As we start to see things get shaky and loans are called in, people can't pay, and they go to the bank and they take out their money or they sell their stocks. Stocks are only worth what people are willing to pay for them. So if everyone's selling and no one's buying, they're worthless. And that's what we really mean by a stock market crash. And this was tough because people were living in the 1920s as if the wealth would not end. The good times would continue, which is part of the reason why they called it the Roaring Twenties. Obviously, there are large sections of the country, demographics that didn't experience this, but for the people who did, it's devastating. The 20s was about marketing for new things and buying cars and radios and all of these kind of flashy, wealthy things, and now there's no money. And this idea of extending credit, which first started in the 20s, getting into the stock market on credit, they called it buying on margin, that did it too. And people just didn't have the cash. Banks were not protected. So when people went to the bank, if the bank had no money, you were out of luck. So it's very scary for people, especially since there was no protection on this. There was no working together either. So this caused a depression, and at its peak, we will see 25% of workers in the country unemployed. That's very high, almost unheard of. Now, to give you some comparison, if we get to about 9%, we worry. So 25% is really scary. And we're not talking about what we're experiencing right now with voluntary reduction of workforces, even mandatory reduction of workforces to try to protect our public health. There's protection that is being pushed through Congress currently to try to help that. In 1929, 1930, in the 1930s, we didn't have that. So people just lost jobs, and we didn't have unemployment insurance or anything to help people through those times. Why the Great Depression happened, it's not a surprise. It's a lot of the same things we've been talking about with financial panics all year. Overproduction. We talked about speculation a lot. In this case, it wasn't so much real estate or land speculation, but speculation in the stock market. You see a couple of people who get crazy rich by investing in some volatile stock or risky venture, and you want in on it too. And that just got too much for places to handle. Similar to early 2000s, when we have what we call the dot-com bubble, where the internet was really just becoming a majorly used thing. Websites popping up, online stores and things, and so many people flooded into it that the bubble popped and people lost money. So similar to that with the stock market. Too much money in the hands of the few. Perpetual problem that we have, not just in this country, but in the world. Wages and salaries too low. When we start to experience inflation and prices going up and our wages are stagnant, we can't afford things anymore. And we don't buy, and then stores experience a struggle too. So nothing surprising. It just happens so much more quickly that it goes deep fast. So how will the government respond? And this is key to Hoover. He does not want to use direct government intervention. He believes in something called rugged individualism. The more the government helps people, the less they know how to help themselves. That is the belief in rugged individualism. You help someone too much, that person loses the ability to help him or herself, which I can appreciate. If you do something for someone all of the time, why would that person learn how to do it, him or herself? So he does not want to intervene. He does not want to give money directly to people to help them through this hard times. He thinks that they'll always expect that. And so instead, what he kind of takes first a do nothing approach, which again isn't overly surprising because we've talked about this before. When we look at the business cycle, we have ups and downs. And so oftentimes we just have to ride out the bad. He doesn't have any way of knowing that this is going to get as bad as it does. And so it's not surprising that he doesn't take more action earlier. When he does start to take action, it is through assisting big business. Give bailout to railroads, banks, other corporations. The idea is supposed to be when you give money to those companies, they have money to keep paying workers, and then unemployment would be relieved. It's called trickle down. We already talked about this. President McKinley was the first one who we use that term to describe his economic philosophy. And it's not the last time. We're going to talk about Ronald Reagan in the 1980s, developing it so much that it's called Reaganomics then, that again, tax cuts at the top, they're supposed to help. It trickle down. Currently, before the virus, I should say, that would be a philosophy of the Trump administration. Nice tax cut at the top, and prosperity should trickle down. Unfortunately, we haven't ever seen a time where trickle down philosophy works. So this is really the first time we see it fail, because companies don't use the money necessarily to keep employment or keep workers on. They might worry that they need that money, tuck it away, keep it for something else, and so that we don't see the relief at the bottom. And again, I think you're starting to notice through most of these videos, I'm trying to give you as much comparison as possible. These are topics that are great essay questions, looking at economic policy and being able to compare and contrast Hoover and Reagan. Great example, that trickle down, or even, Reagan, even bringing in current times would help. And I think looking at this too, the fact that we are experiencing an economic downturn and the federal government is pushing for relief and direct relief. There's talk about payment right to Americans to help them weather the storm. This isn't something that Hoover would do. And honestly, it's surprising that the current administration would support it too, because it's just not a popular Republican philosophy, but I think it's recognizing that it could get worse if there's not relief. So Hoover really pushes Congress to sponsor public works. We want people working and we want to put them to good work and not just give them money. So some examples here, the Hoover Dam was one of them. The old Memorial Auditorium, before we removed that was a public works project. Building roads, dams, buildings, things like that. So real work for people. Another bolded piece here, the Reconstruction Finance Corporation, Government Lending Bank, indirect relief. Again, not giving loans to individual people, not giving handouts to individual people, but letting businesses borrow money. In the end, the government makes money because you have to pay back that loan. There's a nice picture of the Hoover Dam being built. If you've ever been there, you can go on a tour. You can read all about the construction and things like that. Labor, again, the labor movement is going to try to restrain strikes, boycotts, things like that. It's a tough time. There's so many people who are out of work that protecting your job might mean dealing with not the best working conditions, and Congress and Hoover did not mesh well on their approach to this. We'll see a different tactic with President Roosevelt. In the last video, we talked about that Veteran Adjusted Compensation Act and paying them 20 years out, which would have been 1944, 1945, with that kind of gap wage type thing. Well, they're out of work. And they're saying we can't wait until 1945 for this money. It's 1932 and we're suffering. And so they do march on the Capitol. They go to DC. They're protesting. And Hoover basically says, listen, I can't give this to you right now, and I'm going to pay for you to go home. Some of them left. They took his offer and went home. The rest camped out. And this is one of the worst public relations nightmare for Herbert Hoover, because the army comes in to evacuate those veterans who are protesting their need for their money. Douglas MacArthur, we'll see him a lot in World War II. The army brought in bayonets and tear gas to send these veterans home. So again, public relations nightmare. You're dealing with people who sacrificed in the last war and who are desperate during the Great Depression, and you meet that with force. And you can just see this is an example of basically the kind of quick camps that they set up and the Army's attack on them. Same time, we're dealing with a volatile world. Japan has started its imperialistic campaign. We know I'm sure, did a lot of this in global with their lack of resources, and that in order to become a world power, to match the others, they have to take over places, and they do. They've taken over Manchuria. And at first, China is going to the League and saying, can you do something about this? And they can't. They have no enforcement tool, and the whole world is experiencing a depression. So what's happening in China is not really important to them, and the U.S. not being part of it. The U.S. tries to act and says, we won't recognize any acquisition gained by force. There's an informal boycott of Japan, but Japan is just basically like, okay. And they don't care. It's a slap on the wrist, and they just keep continuing. 1937, they're going to take over all of China. So aggression is already starting in the Pacific, and people just aren't responding to it yet. Hoover also is struggling with our relationship with Latin America. We know we've had some dark times. We've occupied many of the countries and have been dictating a lot of what they're doing, and so he really tries to pull out of there. They don't There's not a good payoff for us being there. Before it was protecting investment. There's no money to invest. So we do leave many of these places at this time. So probably a good note for Hoover. But what he's really having to do is his world image in Latin America is not going to be that important right now. What's important is what people are perceiving as a lack of empathy with those going through the Great Depression. He's obviously not touched by it like most people are, and these measures that he is allowing Congress to take time to work, and people are not feeling that they have time. So where we'll go next is obviously the election of 1932. It's not much of a spoiler alert, but Franklin Roosevelt is elected, and his approach is going to be dramatically different than anything we've ever really seen before. So we'll talk about that next week.